Unsafe is the latest foster care memoir from Cathy Glass. This was released, I think, 2 days ago. I jumped on it immediately, and I have to say I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It did feel a little unfinished, but since Cathy Glass does put updates on her website for the various children she's fostered, maybe one day I'll get the answers I was looking for. I kind of need to give a spoiler warning for when I explain what I mean by that, so I'll get into that in a moment. But spoiler free to begin with. Cathy is looking after this 7-year-old boy called Damien. He's a really likeable character, but he's a little bit cheeky. I also say character because, for anybody who's unaware, these books are heavily amended so that the identities of the people involved are heavily amended to protect the identities of the real people. But of course, he is based on a real person, and Cathy is looking after him, and she's been looking after him for quite a while. He goes home to his mother's every weekend. He's in care voluntarily, and, well, his mother put him in care voluntarily. And things are going well so far. His mother is struggling. She has 2 other very young children, but things are going fine. But then somebody comes into his mother's life, and things take a pretty dark turn. I don't want to say any more than that, but it wasn't what I was expecting. Sometimes with foster care memoirs, I feel like what's happening is obvious. And so, I reviewed a foster care memoir recently, not one by Cathy Glass, but where I thought it was so obvious what was happening, and it baffled me that social services didn't understand what was going on to begin with. But with this one, I didn't see any of this coming. And it was quite a shock when certain things were revealed. It was obviously entertaining to read for the right reasons, but very eye-opening as well. And Damien's story takes up about 2/3 of the book, give or take. In the last third of the book, Cathy also looks after a girl called Esme. And I don't want to say too much more about her story, partly because it doesn't take up too much of the book, so I don't want to give too much away. But she ran away from a horrible situation and basically put herself in care because she needed this help, which I think is really great to let people know. Not that I expect many young children are reading Cathy Glass's books, but anything that kind of says, hey, this can actually happen. You know, maybe for slightly older children reading her books who are looking for help, looking for advice, you can't put yourself in care. You can go to social services if you need help. It is something that children can and do, and I think that that's something that maybe children are not necessarily aware of. I don't even know how many children are aware of Childline these days. Hopefully it's something they're still taught about in school. But Esme was in a really difficult situation, and the final third of the book kind of focuses on her and ultimately what happened with that. It was interesting. We also get some more information about Cathy's personal life. Some interesting things are happening. I don't want to say too much more about that either, but I am very curious to see what things will be like in the next book. This one takes place, I think, 2021. So there are quite a few things about COVID. Not as much as her previous foster care memoir, but enough that COVID is still very much there. And it did make me feel a bit sick because it's so easy. I don't know if this is how everybody feels, but I've almost forgotten just how bad things were during the worst of the pandemic, and just how much of a standstill everything was in. And that's not to say I've forgotten it, but I think it's very easy to put it behind us as much as we can and try and move forward, which I think is a very healthy thing to do. But reading it in this book, it does remind me of what it was like. And this book also helps to show how things can affect children in care, parents who only see their children every now and then. The sides to COVID that most of us, thankfully, don't need to think about. And I find that to be really eye-opening and really, really emotional as well. So it's a great read, very well written, and also the grammar is gorgeous. I point this out because certain foster care memoirs, I feel like the publishers don't put their best editors on the books because they're not highbrow literature. They don't need to spend the most time and money on them to make them perfect, but not a problem with Cathy Glass's books at all. Definitely recommend it. So I guess spoilers, I'm still not going to explain what happens to any of the children involved, but I do want to say why I feel like it felt unfinished. So I do have to kind of say very briefly something. And the reason I feel like it felt unfinished is because when we get to the end of, Damien's story, which as I said was about 2/3 of the way in, it switches to Esme's, and I thought, okay, this is interesting. but it'll come back to Damien, and we'll kind of have some kind of conclusion for that narrative. And it never did, and I genuinely feel like they forgot to include a chapter at the end, or even a mention in the epilogue. I just wanted some kind of, at the time of writing, Damien is still where he was. I can't say too much about it. Or some kind of, just some recognition that Damien's story hadn't been forgotten about, because that's kind of what it felt like. His story reached a point where it made sense for the focus to switch to Esme, but not in a way where I felt like I, as a reader, was satisfied with that story. I kind of wanted some kind of, even just acknowledgement that nothing had changed. At the time of writing, there was no update. That's all I wanted. But it otherwise, because there's no mention, it just feels like he's been forgotten about, and that they almost forgot that this was the story, the main story that was being told. So I was a little bit disappointed by that. But as I said, Cathy Glass does put updates on her website, so that's something I will be looking out for. It's not even so much that I was desperate to find out what happened next, because I feel like I know what's going to happen next. I can predict what is the likely outcome. But I just wanted some acknowledgement that Damien's story hadn't been neglected, because that's kind of how it felt. So that was not a great way to end it, but I still really thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I guess it's going to be another 6 months or so before Cathy Glass's next book is out. I always get to the day before the release and end up buying the parts. The ebooks are released in 3 parts, like part 1 and 2 are released in advance of the full ebook. And then you can either choose to buy part 1, 2, and 3 or buy the full ebook. And I always get to the day before the release and cave and buy parts 1 and 2, and then I buy part 3 the next day. I'm so impatient. It's ridiculous. I love these books so, so much. And if you've never read any foster care memoirs, I feel like Unsafe is a good place to start, because it is gripping, it is fascinating, it is shocking in places, but it's not horrendous. It's kind of a good entry level to see if you're going to be a fan of this kind of book without providing anything that's too disturbing. Um, but I enjoyed it, even if it's not, the most shocking. It was still pretty unexpected. I can't wait for Cathy Glass's next book, and apart from feeling slightly dissatisfied with the treatment of Damien's story at the end, or lack thereof, I still really thoroughly recommend Unsafe.